Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for our attendees to file in. So for just a couple of minutes, you're going to be staring at our blank faces, but we will begin very shortly. I'm going to get started from now. See, people are already making good use of the chat. Please do feel free to use the chat throughout, and also the Q&A function to ask questions of our fantastic guests today. I'm delighted to be joined by Natalie Orringe, who wrote our recent white paper, Communicating the New Immediacy of Finance. Good morning, Natalie.
Hi, Jake.
And also Habito's Romney Taylor and Missive's Erin Lovett. Good morning, both.
Hi.
Morning.
My name's Jake O'Neill, but I am going to hand almost immediately over to Natalie as she created the white paper, and we would love her to start the conversation. Natalie, over to you.
Brilliant, Jake. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's dialed in, and a particular thanks to Romney and Erin, who've been thoroughly brilliant and given us lots of time in producing this report. So I guess what I'm going to do is just talk for about 5 or so minutes just to give you a real summary of the main themes within the report, and then we're going to go into a questionnaire Q&A with our panelists, and then move into answering some of the questions that you might have as the session goes through. And I guess as a kickoff point, I thought it might be useful just to talk about the context of the report. It really came about because of this interest that we've all had in how technology is changing the way that financial brands talk to consumers and investors. And I guess it's all a bit old hat to say, well, we understand that money's now suddenly more immediate than maybe it's ever been because we've got an app on our phone, or we might be able to use any sort of mobile device or any sort of laptop to manage our savings and investments. But actually, the question underneath it is, what does that mean for communications? And really, what does that mean for the relationship that providers are now developing with consumers? And so to really understand that challenge, we went out and spoke to some of the experts in the field, ranging from Ian Silvera, who's leading the crypto team at SEC Newgate, through to Romney, who's VP Marketing at Habito, who are a challenger mortgage provider, Erin, who's an account director at Missive, who are an agency at the kind of nexus between technology and financial services, Joe Preston, who's director at Team Spirit, a specialist FS agency, and also Emily Ballet, who's founder of Vestpod, who are a really interesting almost platform trying to challenge the way that financial brands talk about money with women. And I guess what was really interesting in those conversations was that there were some really clear themes. The first of which is that technology is changing so quickly and will always constantly change. We're in a sort of ceaseless world of transformation, but actually it's becoming so complex that trying to explain how those products work is only becoming more difficult. And in fact, what we're finding is that there are some pockets of consumers and investors who feel they're really sophisticated, but actually, if you really were to ask them a question, don't necessarily understand the risk they're taking on. And that there are also some people who are now just switched off from the technology. So it's a bit like your iPhone. You don't really understand how the processing works, but you just know that you love the pictures at the other end. So what does that mean for us as communicators? How do we sort of manage that gap between products that are very sophisticated and very complex and consumers? And then also, how do we do that in a world where communications platforms are now so real-time, so hyper-responsive, that actually we've got to communicate in real time on topics not just about our products, but also about societal issues, for example, employment trends or gender pay gap. And in that world of ceaselessly changing comms, ceaselessly changing tech, what does that mean for communicators? And how do you build the right teams that have got the right skills in place to navigate some of those challenges? So again, underneath all of that is not to say, oh my God, it's too frightening, let's get to the edge of the cliff and just give up, it's too much. But actually, what do we do? And what's the right thing to do? And I think there are some really interesting trends around not only just being immediate and being authentic, but also about being responsible. And some of that responsibility is also about thinking through some of the challenges around ESG communications. I know that's one of the big topics, framing how communications is changing sort of post-COVID, post-pandemic, but also in a sort of an era of hyper transparency. But I guess within all of that, what should we be doing to really help organisations distill down their brand narrative, be clear about their how and their what, and then also say that consistently across multiple challenges? So that's going to be some of what I'm going to come on to talk about with Romney and with Erin. And I guess underneath all of that was also a sense that, if we stand back, financial services has been talked about as being sort of merged into software and technology for a very long time. But actually, those blurring of boundaries, the fact that we can access money in so many different ways across so many different technologies, that's really exciting, but also it comes with quite a heavy burden. And I think the point I'd almost sort of leave us with is actually that new area of responsibility is also about translating that immediacy into lasting, sustainable relationships with consumers. And that's a really exciting opportunity, because what it means is that, in effect, PR and communications can really be operationalized into organizations' strategy. So I guess that was both the challenge, but also the really exciting sort of takeaway from the report was this new opportunity for where PR and communications gets to. So obviously I've rattled through the report and spoken at speed, so I would really also encourage you to download the report from the Vuelio website, from their blog, and also I'd be really happy to take questions, not only today, but if you've got further questions, just to contact me through LinkedIn. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and also one that's not really going anywhere. Just as technology is changing, so will the way that we have to communicate with our target audiences. But to dive into some of the questions that I wanted to ask our brilliant panelists today, I'm actually going to start off with Erin. And part of the conversation that Erin and I had also echoed some of the themes that Ian talked to from SEC Newgate about the challenge of how you encourage brands who are at the forefront of new technology. So in this case, cryptocurrencies and fintechs. How do you encourage those brands to take on sort of more responsibility? And I guess, Erin, maybe the question for you is maybe you can explain why communications for brands, such as cryptocurrency brands, why does communication strategy have to be distinct to other, maybe more mainstream financial products?
I think the big difference for me is simply around education, and comes in the kind of traditional financial services space. That has always been the goal, has been to kind of educate consumers on what is being offered and the benefits of that, and why X solution is better than Y. With things like cryptocurrency, you're entering a really interesting space where actually a lot of it has been driven by quite a small group of consumers who feel incredibly educated on the subject already. And that may be true in some respects, it may be less true in others. I think there's certainly not the kind of acceptance of the kind of risk involved. And actually then, communicators need to take quite a strong stance there, because we need to be walking that line between actually, educating them on things that maybe they think they already understand, but obviously without kind of, alienating or kind of patronizing anyone. So it's really kind of moving away from education on the benefits of things to almost educating on the risks while still framing that in a positive way.
And I guess, the important thing to say there is that need to be responsible also goes hand in hand with that being a section of the market which isn't yet regulated. And I guess, do you feel that as an agency, when you're talking to brands in that space, you're almost sort of stepping into being almost the de facto regulator, as in you're guiding them through to what good behaviour looks like?
A little bit, yes, which is it's a really interesting role to be in. And I think there's a lot of parallels with kind of ESG, as you were talking about earlier, because again, there's no kind of formal global standards on that set yet. So, you are, as the kind of communicators, hopefully you are in the boardroom talking at that senior level, and it needs to be around, not just like what can and should we say, but what can we justify and what can we prove, and actually without, the things to back it up. And in a really kind of, way where you are confident telling like individuals and, you're confident telling your friends and family about that sort of thing. That's the line for me personally. And I think that's increasingly a line for a lot of PRs. It's, would I feel comfortable if one of, a close friend of mine became a customer of this brand? If not, there's probably, you probably should be stepping back.
So that's interesting. So then has that fed into how Missive thinks about how you initially might speak to clients, or maybe some of the initial onboarding with new organisations you work with?
I think Missive's always had quite kind of, strict due diligence processes, in all honesty, but I think definitely this is, kind of raising a new challenge because, there aren't those regulations out there. There's no, kind of formal guidance on this, but we are, very careful with who we work with. And I think definitely that kind of, personal gut feeling that does come into it now.
It's really interesting, and I guess it was to the point that I made in my introduction about this, almost how do you operationalise responsibility into not only communication strategy, but how organisations actually behave operationally, from a strategic level right through to thinking about how do products get designed, which is a really neat segue to talking to Romney about Habito. And I know that something that Romney and I talked about a lot were really some of how the values of how Habito has been put together, including how it's taken on sort of Plan B status and gone through that process, have then been fed through into how communications and marketing have really been designed. And Romney, I wondered whether you can just give us a bit of a sort of a summary of actually why you think you've got quite a distinct model for how you approach comms and marketing, and also just almost that segue between comms and marketing right through to organizational strategy.
Yeah, most definitely. And we are a highly regulated business in that we started life as a mortgage broker, an online mortgage broker, but have grown the proposition to be more of a home buying service. So we are regulated by the FCA as a mortgage broker to give regulated mortgage advice, and as a lender. So we're a lender as well. And most recently regulated by the CLC to provide conveyancing services. So yeah, just, highly regulated. Take responsibility very seriously. So Habito is a very mission-driven business, and we have 4 values that really guide our decision-making and how we operate the business. And one of those 4 values is be 100% responsible, which means as team members, taking responsibility for more than just our part of the business, and really treating colleagues, customers, business partners as a community. Habito is also a B Corp, so we have a legal commitment there to take responsibility for the impact that our work has. And so transparency is a huge kind of part of that. Approach our comms and our marketing with a huge amount of transparency, which is just, we treat that as just being really honest with our customers. So you spoke a little bit about the integration of our marketing and communications teams. Everything that we do, everything that we put out, from our communication platform to our press releases, are all very much rooted in a customer insight. And we try and be really honest with people about the fact that getting a mortgage is hellish. It's a very stressful thing. People have their time wasted, they get ripped off, they're bombarded with jargon. And because there are so many actors involved in getting a mortgage, we've obviously tried to reduce that number by broadening the service to lending and conveyancing as well, but there are still valuations and estate agents to deal with. So we kind of talk to those emotions and try and be kind of as honest as we can, and take responsibility for, as I said, more than just our part. So where the valuation comes back and a customer's let down, we'll do whatever we can to rectify that for a customer.
And I guess that point around honesty is really interesting, because that's also about acknowledging where things go wrong. Romney, do you see that as being hand in hand with you at Habito, taking a stance on issues? So, for example, I know that we talked about how quickly you responded to budget announcements, for example, which have big impact on the mortgage space. But do you think you are now, as an organisation, seeing that you've got a responsibility to help consumers better understand almost the wider world that has impact on their decision making, or how these products might change?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because one of the early truths that we had to reckon with was that people really switch off when you talk to them about mortgages. People don't want to talk about mortgages, rarely. You can try that next time you're at a dinner party and see how it goes. When people get really interested in mortgages is when they're in market for a mortgage. So when they own their own home and they're interested in how the macroeconomic environment is going to affect their monthly payments, because ultimately that's what matters to them. Or if they're saving up to buy their first home, and house prices are changing, that's when they're really interested in how much they can borrow. So yeah, we obviously try and talk to people when they're open to hearing about it, and that's when our content around mortgages really plays through. And yeah, we do take a wider stance, and we talk about issues that affect people more broadly. but again, we try and make it as relevant as possible to where they're at in their lives. So yeah, recently we're talking about things like childcare costs and how massive those are for people. You know, they tend to be the biggest cost after paying off your mortgage. So we try and find the things that affect people who are in a space where they're open to hearing to them from us.
So it's really interesting then, because it sounds like part of how you're constructing a narrative and delivering communications is also about beginning with the use case. So how are people going to be using products, and actually then using that as a jumping off point to talk about the benefit and the risk. And Erin, maybe if I can come back to you on that, because I know that, again, part of our discussion, particularly around some of the outliers in the digital currency, cryptocurrency space, is one of the challenges is how to explain that use case. So, you know, if you're talking to someone about Bitcoin or blockchain, it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to get beyond, let's talk about the transaction between traders versus actually what this product could do at an end case. And do you see that as a challenge? And is that a challenge that you think is different, or is that a challenge that's always been there? You know, in that we've always had products there where people wanted to start with the amazing piece of AI that they'd used to build it, rather than actually what it did.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think it's a new challenge. I think it's just being, you know, now we're experiencing it on kind of new technologies essentially. And I think blockchain is a great example, and because there are huge applications for blockchain that go far beyond cryptocurrency. And that is obviously still kind of, you know, the main kind of use case that everyone's aware of. But equally, you do have to, again, you need to walk that line, because actually we don't need to know the ins and outs of, as consumers, of how things work. You know, you take the example from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? You know, I couldn't build a toaster. I can't, you know, but I'm very happy using electricity. So I think it's about kind of getting that balance right. And I think the information needs to be available to consumers if they want it. That's absolutely crucial. I don't think there's any argument for kind of restricting that and oversimplifying in all scenarios. I think you've got to make it available. But equally, I don't think we need people, like, you know, consumers, to understand the ins and outs of how a kind of cryptocurrency transaction works. As long as they understand the risks associated with it, then that's probably all they need to know.
But it does also point to the fact that you need someone in your team who can understand that technology in order to then distill it down to being an understandable story. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point then, isn't it? Because it's both about how do you get to a very powerful and impactful why for every organisation, but also how do you make sure that your teams have got those skills within them, so that you've both got storytellers, but also you've got someone who can actually get to grips comfortably with that very sophisticated underlying product.
100%. I mean, the pace of change has accelerated so much that, you know, I think that kind of that industry knowledge and training has never been more important. And it is interesting that, you know, even over the span of my career, I've seen the kind of balance of, you know, CPD and additional training that people are doing used to be very skewed towards PR skills. And then the kind of industry knowledge was, you know, kind of a distant second. That I don't think is the case anymore at all, especially, you know, from what I see at Missive, it is very 50-50. And we're very focused on kind of personal development and training. And, you know, there is lots of time still put into PR skills, but also exactly as you say, we've got to be able to explain, you know, cryptocurrency transactions, open banking, things like that. And actually you can't do that unless you are really familiar with how that stuff works. So it's interesting because people are now kind of splitting their educational time into the vertical aspects as well.
That's really interesting. And I guess one of the things that I sort of took from that, and again in my experience, is that also it allows PR teams to be much more diverse than they've ever been. You know, I talked briefly in the report about how back in the day when I started, if you're a generalist, that was brilliant. But now I think you really need to be able to have specialists in your team and also know the expert to go to when you don't have all the answers. Just before we jump into a slightly more open Q&A with our attendees, I just wondered if I could ask Romney and Erin to maybe give examples of brands in financial services that you think are really cracking the kind of not only storytelling to build trust, but also maybe the education challenge that they face. And maybe Erin, you might kick us off.
Absolutely. So I think one brand doing this really well is PensionBee. And I think, you know, this kind of very much comes back to what you were saying in your introduction, Natalie, around, you know, the kind of ultimate goals haven't changed, right? Pensions themselves haven't changed. Nothing about this is new, but PensionBee is using technology to make that easier for consumers. And they're wrapping it up in a way that, like, all their campaigns are around education and simplifying that and, you know, making it more accessible and understandable to consumers. And I think they've done a really, really excellent job of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, it's so funny, isn't it, that they're almost award-winning for doing what you just wanted every single pension provider do, which is
it's not really groundbreaking. It's just doing the fundamentals really well.
Yeah. And Romney, what about you? Do you have a brand that you think actually that's the one that I'm following, or that's the one I'm taking inspiration from?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the brand, I get made fun of a lot because I'm such a fan of this brand, but so Cash App in financial services for me is the brand that is my go-to for all of this stuff and beyond. So they're US based. They are predominantly P2P money sending, but they are trying to replace bank accounts. And they're international, so but not as big in the UK. So yeah, massive on Instagram. And when they share sort of tips on investing and cryptocurrency on Instagram, they call it Cash App Wisdom. They just have this amazing way of kind of penetrating the culture. They work a lot with influencers. They do tons of like $500,000 and $1 million Bitcoin giveaways on Twitter and Instagram. And there's a really sort of simple site that they pulled together on Cash App /stocks, which is called My First Bitcoin. And I guess as a primer for cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, it's a really good sort of basic, almost told like a children's story. So yeah, they do education in an amazing way, and in a very kind of culturally relevant way, I feel.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, it's also, I think, so important that we look to the US and almost global markets. Again, I was doing some work looking at some of the Nigerian new entrants, but the way that they're approaching comms is very different. But again, thinking about the challenges that we face, that we recognise that they're going to be getting more and more complex and will never really stop changing, then actually being able to look to other brands that are doing it well and take a bit of guidance, I think is really powerful. So Jake, just having kind of wrapped up our panelist questions, maybe I can hand over to you. I don't know if there are any questions that have come in from our audience.
Yeah, we've had a couple come through already, and I'm just going to, the two examples that also have been asked for in the chat. So that was Cash App from Romney and Pension B from Erin. If you want to look them up, I'm sure we can share the links for those as well. But the questions that have come in via the Q&A, one for Erin: is there an ethical issue working with crypto or NFT clients?
Not in principle, no. I think, you can absolutely have, crypto and NFT companies that are operating absolutely kind of ethically and within the spirit of financial services regulation as it stands as well. I think it's just about being careful, that obviously there are companies out there that aren't quite as kind of, pro all of that stuff. So I don't think there's an issue with it overall, but I do think you need to do careful due diligence and make sure that you understand the service they're providing to consumers and, crucially, the risks of that service as well. And at that point, you can make a call as an agency, as an individual, on whether you are comfortable representing them.
That makes sense. Just I'm going to follow up, if that's okay, with one of my own off the back of that. Is there a link between NFTs, cryptocurrencies, and I guess the ESG element related to climate? Because obviously it's quite a huge energy source drain. I don't know what to use the right word, but for that kind of technology, does it link back to ESG concern and risk in financial services?
For me, it's less about ESG, if I'm honest. I think, cryptocurrency and kind of crypto mining in particular obviously gets a really bad rap in terms of the ESG impact, but that is the same for, essentially every aspect of modern life, right? If any of you, and myself included, are wearing clothes from any kind of, supermarket or kind of, high street fashion retail place, there's ESG challenges there as well. So I think for me, it's the ethical risks are quite specific to being around that consumer risk and consumer understanding of what they're putting at risk as well.
That makes perfect sense, and that's, I guess, what the role of communications can do for that. It's perfectly placed. Another question for Romney: how do you push your values without it looking like woke washing?
So I mean, I guess it's just about being authentic. Is how we do that. So a good example of that recently is the fact that there's a war going on in the Ukraine that everyone's aware of, and businesses, I guess, you know, a lot of businesses have responded in ways that are kind of relevant or not. And we wanted to, obviously everyone at Habito is deeply saddened by what's going on in the Ukraine, but unlike a business like Revolut, which interestingly has a Ukrainian and a Russian founder, right? Sorry, two co-founders are, one is Russian, one is Ukrainian. And they have a large team there. So they had a very public response to what's going on in the Ukraine. We didn't sort of want to speak publicly on that until we had something relevant to say. So the government came out with their Homes for Ukraine initiative, where obviously people in the UK could offer their homes to Ukrainian refugees. So it was at that point that we sort of, you know, spoke out on what's going on in the Ukraine. We spoke about the government's new scheme that allows people to open up their homes to Ukrainian refugees. And we told people, again, how does that affect you if you either rent or if you own your own home? So interestingly, if you have a mortgage and you want to open your home up to a Ukrainian refugee, you need to notify your lender. So again, we spoke more broadly about what's going on in Ukraine. We spoke about the scheme and how you can register your interest and what's going on there, but then also, you know, as a homeowner or prospective homeowner, what does that mean for you? Oh, great, like you should definitely notify your lender that you've signed up for the scheme and that you're going to be housing a refugee. So yeah, it's just about, you know, woke washing would have been like, you know, changing our LinkedIn image to a blue and yellow, you know, around the Habito logo or something, and not having anything really relevant to say. And we didn't sort of jump into that until we did have something to say on the issue. So that's how we avoid those sorts of situations.
I think, I mean, and that was one of, it's a really important takeaway that to avoid this all comms looking like it's just a bit trite, you need to make sure that it's underpinned by the action. And there was an example that that actually Romney flagged to me when we were speaking around International Women's Day, and I'm sure you would have seen the sort of Twitter storm where a chatbot posted the gender pay gap to all the organisations that were posting their support for International Women's Day. And I think it's a really simple example of actually how the world has changed. It's not longer good enough just to go out with a stance. You've really got to live it within the organisation and then enact it in the way that you behave. So it's a really good example from Romney, but I think it's really important for us as communicators to then think about authentically what should we be talking about and how can we make sure that whatever we stand for, we're making sure the organisation then lives up to in everything it does.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We're actually at the end of our time. It really does fly by. Natalie, I'd like to thank you for effectively hosting this. Made my job a lot easier, but also for your excellent work on the white paper. Thank you. And of course to our wonderful guests, Romney and Erin. Thank you both for your time this morning and sharing your insights. And getting thanks in the chat. And yeah, thanks for everyone for listening. The recording will be with you shortly afterwards.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye now.
Bye everyone.